Marcus Chun stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of the downtown Seattle diner, where he'd worked the graveyard shift for the past 3 years. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across features that had once commanded respect in rooms where national security decisions were made. Now those same features served him well in remaining unnoticed among the late-night crowd of truckers, insomniacs, and people who had nowhere else to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 35, Marcus had perfected the art of invisibility. In plain sight, his black hair, slightly longer than regulation length, fell across his forehead in a way that obscured the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes. The faded uniform shirt with Night Owl Diner embroidered above the pocket hung loose on his lean frame, disguising the disciplined posture that years of specialized training had ingrained in his muscle memory. To anyone watching, he was exactly what he appeared to be: another overnight worker grinding through another shift in a job that society barely noticed. The diner's kitchen timer chimed, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. He splashed cold water on his face, dried his hands on the scratchy paper towels, and returned to the dining area where the usual collection of night owls had gathered. Table 6 held Jim, a long-haul trucker who always ordered black coffee and apple pie, never speaking beyond the necessities of placing his order. The corner booth hosted Sarah, a nurse finishing her shift at the nearby hospital, who preferred decaf and wheat toast while she unwound from 12 hours of saving lives. Marcus moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates with the kind of fluid motion that came from repetition rather than passion. The work wasn't challenging, but it served his purposes perfectly. No one asked personal questions at 3 in the morning. No one expected explanations about his past or plans for his future. He was simply Marcus, the reliable night shift guy who kept the coffee hot and the grill clean. The bell above the entrance chimed, and Detective Ray Moretti shuffled through the door, his rumpled coat and tired eyes telling the story of another long night dealing with Seattle's criminal element. Moretti had become a regular over the past year, stopping by after particularly difficult cases when sleep seemed impossible, and the familiar routine of late-night coffee felt more appealing than staring at his apartment ceiling. "Rough night," Moretti said, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. It wasn't a question. Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether the detective wanted conversation or silence, and tonight clearly fell into the latter category. Marcus poured coffee into a white ceramic mug, the kind of thick, institutional dishware that every diner in America seemed to stock. "Apple turnovers are fresh," he offered, knowing that Moretti rarely ate during these visits, but appreciating when someone acknowledged his presence as more than just a coffee dispenser. "Maybe later," Moretti replied, wrapping his hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from more than just the temperature. "You ever think about doing something else, Marcus? I mean, you're obviously intelligent. You could probably do better than this place." The question hit closer to home than Moretti probably intended. Marcus had indeed done better than this place. Much better. But that life belonged to someone else now, someone whose existence had been officially erased from government databases and whose skills had been deemed too dangerous for continued employment in the intelligence community. "I like the quiet," Marcus replied, which was true enough. After years of operating in environments where silence could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, the gentle hum of the diner's refrigeration units and the occasional clink of silverware felt almost meditative. Moretti nodded, accepting the non-answer in the way that experienced investigators learned to recognize when pushing further would yield nothing useful. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the detective staring into his coffee, while Marcus restocked the napkin dispensers and wiped down surfaces that were already clean. The second bell chime of the evening brought Tommy Kowalski through the door, a security guard from the federal building downtown who often stopped by during his rounds. Tommy carried himself with the inflated confidence of someone whose authority extended exactly as far as his uniform and badge allowed, and no further. He'd made several attempts over the months to befriend Marcus, apparently viewing the diner worker as someone who might be impressed by stories of his professional responsibilities. "Evening, Marcus," Tommy said, settling 2 stools down from Moretti with the studied casualness of someone who wanted to be noticed. "Coffee and a burger, if you don't mind. Been a long night keeping the government types safe." Marcus began preparing the order, listening with practiced patience as Tommy launched into his usual routine of describing his job with far more dramatic flair than checking identification badges and operating metal detectors really warranted. The federal building where Tommy worked housed several agencies, including regional offices for departments that most civilians had never heard of, but which played crucial roles in national security operations. "You wouldn't believe some of the stuff I see," Tommy continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone who believed he was sharing classified information rather than routine observations. "High-level meetings, people with clearances so secret they can't even tell you what department they work for. Just last week, we had some kind of emergency briefing that brought in suits from Washington. Whatever they were discussing, it was serious enough that they cleared out 2 entire floors." Detective Moretti glanced up from his coffee, his professional instincts apparently piqued by the mention of federal activity. "Emergency briefing? That sounds unusual for a regional office." Tommy leaned forward conspiratorially, clearly enjoying the attention. "That's what I thought. But you know how it is with these government types. They act like everything they do is saving the world from some invisible threat. Most of the time, it's probably just paperwork and budget meetings dressed up to sound important." Marcus flipped the burger on the grill, his movements automatic while his mind processed Tommy's information. The timing Tommy mentioned corresponded with something Marcus had noticed in the encrypted communications traffic he still monitored out of professional habit. Increased chatter between certain agencies, coded references to what appeared to be a developing situation that required coordination between multiple departments. 3 years of working the night shift had taught Marcus that information flowed differently in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. People spoke more freely when they were tired. Guards came down when the formal structure of daytime operations gave way to the informal connections that really kept organizations functioning. He'd learned more about Seattle's various power structures and hidden networks during late-night conversations than most investigative journalists discovered in months of formal research. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Speaking of government types," Tommy said, pulling out his phone to check the time, "I should probably get back to the building. We've got some kind of special security briefing tomorrow morning. They're bringing in new protocols for handling certain types of visitors. Apparently, there's been some concern about people using fake credentials to gain access to sensitive areas." The mention of fake credentials caused something to shift in Marcus's chest, a tightness that he'd learned to recognize as his subconscious responding to information that his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. During his previous career, credential verification had been one of the fundamental skills that separated competent intelligence operatives from those who ended up compromised or dead. "Fake credentials," Moretti repeated, his detective instincts clearly engaged. "That sounds like something law enforcement should know about." Tommy shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who viewed such concerns as outside his pay grade. "Probably just routine security theater. You know how paranoid these federal agencies get. Someone probably tried to use an expired parking pass, and now they're treating it like a national security crisis." Marcus served the burger with practiced efficiency, but his mind was no longer focused on the simple mechanics of diner work. The combination of increased federal activity, new security protocols, and concerns about credential verification painted a picture that his trained instincts recognized as potentially significant. Not necessarily dangerous, but worth monitoring. After Tommy left to return to his rounds and Moretti finished his coffee in contemplative silence, Marcus found himself alone with the familiar sounds of the empty diner. The refrigeration units hummed their steady rhythm. The coffee maker gurgled through another brewing cycle. And somewhere in the kitchen, a fluorescent light flickered with the irregular pattern that he'd been meaning to fix for weeks. He pulled out his personal laptop, a device that appeared unremarkable but contained hardware modifications that would have impressed certain government technicians. The encryption software launched automatically, connecting him to networks that officially didn't exist and monitoring communication frequencies that weren't supposed to be accessible to civilian equipment. What he found confirmed his growing suspicion that Tommy's casual observations were connected to something larger than routine security updates. Multiple federal agencies were coordinating on what appeared to be a manhunt, though the coded language made it difficult to determine exactly who they were seeking or what crimes had been committed. References to compromised credentials and insider threat assessment suggested that someone with high-level access had either gone rogue or been discovered operating under false pretenses. Marcus closed the laptop and returned to his routine cleaning duties, but his mind continued processing the implications of what he'd discovered. 3 years of anonymity had created a comfortable distance from the world of intelligence operations and national security concerns. He'd built a life where his biggest worry was whether the coffee maker would survive another month, and if Jim the trucker would ever order something besides apple pie. But old habits died hard, and the skills that had once made him one of the most effective deep-cover operatives in government service weren't the kind that simply disappeared with career changes. He recognized patterns, identified connections, and maintained situational awareness even when part of him wished he could simply ignore the subtle signs that indicated his peaceful existence might be about to become complicated. The rest of his shift passed quietly, with only a few customers filtering through during the pre-dawn hours, when the city began its slow transition from night to day. By 6 in the morning, the day shift supervisor arrived to take over operations, freeing Marcus to begin the walk home to his small apartment in the neighborhood, where anonymity was easy to maintain and questions were rarely asked. His apartment reflected the same philosophy of deliberate ordinariness that governed every aspect of his current life. Functional furniture purchased from discount stores, walls decorated with generic art prints that conveyed no personal information, and technology that appeared completely unremarkable to casual observation. The only hint of his previous life existed in a hidden compartment behind his bedroom closet, where certain documents and equipment waited in carefully controlled conditions against the possibility that his old skills might someday be needed. Again, Marcus made coffee using a simple drip machine, sat at his small kitchen table, and watched the morning news while his mind continued processing the information he'd gathered during the night. The lead story focused on routine political developments, followed by weather and traffic reports that confirmed Seattle was experiencing another typical Pacific Northwest morning. Nothing in the mainstream media suggested that federal agencies were coordinating any kind of unusual security operation. His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena Vasquez, the day shift supervisor at the diner who'd become something approaching a friend over the past year. "Can you cover part of tonight's shift?" Sandra called in sick and were short-staffed. Marcus replied that he'd be available, then spent the rest of the morning maintaining the careful routine that had become his life. Grocery shopping at the neighborhood market where the clerks knew him as a polite customer who always paid in cash and never caused problems. Laundry at the coin-operated facility where he could sit quietly with a paperback novel while his clothes cycled through the Kia machines. A brief stop at the library to return books and select new ones, maintaining his cover as someone whose intellectual interests ran toward popular fiction rather than the technical manuals and classified publications that had once occupied his reading time. By early afternoon, he'd returned to his apartment for the sleep that would prepare him for another night shift. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while traffic sounds filtered through his windows, Marcus found his mind returning to the fragmented information he'd collected. Someone with high-level government credentials was operating under false pretenses. Federal agencies were coordinating what appeared to be a search operation. New security protocols were being implemented to address threats that weren't being discussed in public channels. Individually, these elements might represent routine security concerns or bureaucratic overreactions to minor incidents. Together, they suggested something more significant. The kind of situation that Marcus's former colleagues would be working to resolve while the public remained unaware that any threat existed. He'd learned to recognize the difference between theoretical concerns and operational realities, between security theater and genuine threats that required immediate attention. What he was observing felt like the latter, though he couldn't yet determine whether the situation posed any danger to his carefully constructed civilian existence. Marcus had chosen invisibility not because he was hiding from specific enemies, but because his particular skill set had made him too valuable to too many people with conflicting agendas. Government agencies wanted to retain his services. Foreign intelligence services wanted to recruit or eliminate him. Criminal organizations wanted to exploit his capabilities for their own purposes. The simplest solution had been to disappear entirely, becoming someone so unremarkable that none of these groups would think to look for him among the late-night diner workers of urban America. But 3 years of anonymity had also taught him that complete disconnection from his former world was neither possible nor entirely wise. The skills that had made him effective as an intelligence operative also made him uniquely qualified to recognize when patterns in information flow suggested developing situations that might eventually affect civilian populations. His phone alarm woke him at 5 in the evening, signaling time to prepare for another night shift. Marcus showered, dressed in his diner uniform, and made the familiar walk through Seattle's downtown core toward the Night Owl Diner. The evening commute was beginning to thin out, replaced by the different energy of people whose work or social lives kept them active during the transition between day and night. As he approached the federal building where Tommy worked, Marcus noticed increased security presence. Additional guards at the entrances, vehicles parked in positions that suggested coordination rather than coincidence, and the subtle signs of heightened alertness that indicated something beyond routine operations was taking place. He continued walking without altering his pace or direction, but his trained observation skills cataloged details that most civilians would have missed entirely. The extra security appeared professional and coordinated, suggesting federal rather than local law enforcement. The positioning of personnel indicated they were prepared for specific threats rather than general crowd control. Most significantly, the overall atmosphere felt more like crisis management than routine security enhancement. Marcus arrived at the diner 20 minutes before his shift began, using the extra time to review the day's receipts and prepare the coffee service for the evening rush. Elena was finishing her own shift, but she lingered to brief him on the day's events and express her appreciation for his willingness to cover the extra hours. "Busy day," she said, gesturing toward the dining area where several tables still held customers finishing their early dinners. "Lot of people coming through who seemed stressed about something. Government workers mostly. They were all checking their phones constantly and talking in whispers like they were worried about being overheard." This additional information fit with Marcus's growing sense that whatever was developing in the federal security apparatus was affecting people throughout the local government community. Elena was observant in the way that experienced service workers developed through years of reading customer moods and managing social dynamics, and her assessment of increased stress levels among government employees suggested that the situation was more serious than routine security updates. Anything specific they were discussing? Marcus asked, though he knew Elena was too professional to have deliberately eavesdropped on customer conversations. Hard not to overhear when people are upset, she replied. Something about security. Clearances being reviewed, people being asked to verify their identities multiple times, meetings being canceled or moved to secure facilities. Nothing that made complete sense to me, but definitely something that had them worried. After Elena left, Marcus began his evening routine of preparing the diner for the night shift. But his attention was divided between routine tasks and processing the additional information she'd provided. Security clearance reviews, identity verification requirements, and movement of meetings to secure facilities all suggested that federal agencies were responding to some kind of insider threat or security breach. The evening progressed with its usual pattern of late shift workers, insomniacs, and people whose lives operated on schedules that didn't align with conventional business hours. But Marcus noticed subtle differences in the customer flow. More government employees than usual, and their conversations carried an undertone of tension that was unusual even for people dealing with the stress of federal employment. Around 10 o'clock, Detective Moretti appeared again, looking even more tired than he had the previous night. He settled into his usual position at the counter, but instead of ordering coffee immediately, he sat quietly for several minutes, staring at his hands as if they might contain answers to questions he was struggling to formulate. "You hear anything unusual today?" Moretti asked finally, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was fishing for information without wanting to reveal why. Marcus poured coffee without being asked, a gesture that had become automatic during their late-night interactions. "Depends what you mean by unusual. Busy day, lot of stressed customers. Government workers seemed particularly on edge." Moretti nodded slowly, apparently confirming something he'd already suspected. "We've been getting requests for assistance from federal agencies. Nothing specific, just notifications that they might need local law enforcement support for some kind of operation. Usually when they tell us that, it means they're dealing with something they can't handle through normal channels." The admission represented a significant level of trust, given that Moretti typically kept his professional concerns separate from their casual diner conversations. Marcus recognized the detective's need to process information with someone who might provide perspective without creating official complications. "Any sense of what kind of operation?" Marcus asked, maintaining the tone of casual curiosity that regular customers might express when discussing current events. "That's the thing," Moretti replied, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. "They're being very vague about the details. Just saying they're conducting a security investigation that might require coordination with local authorities. But the federal agents I've spoken with seem genuinely concerned about something. Not the usual bureaucratic caution, but the kind of worry that comes from dealing with real threats." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that indicated his subconscious was processing information faster than his conscious mind could follow. The combination of federal security concerns, local law enforcement notifications, and increased stress among government employees was beginning to form a pattern that his training had taught him to recognize as potentially dangerous. "Probably just routine security theater," he said, echoing Tommy's dismissive assessment from the previous night while carefully monitoring Moretti's reaction. The detective shook his head. "I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between security theater and genuine concern. Whatever they're dealing with, it's serious enough that multiple agencies are involved, and they're prepared to request significant local resources. That doesn't happen unless someone believes there's a real threat to public safety." Before Marcus could respond, the diner's bell chimed again, admitting Tommy Kowalski in what appeared to be a state of Considerable agitation. Instead of his usual confident demeanor, the security guard looked nervous and uncertain, checking over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. "Marcus, detective," Tommy said, nodding to both men as he took a seat at the counter. "I need coffee, and I need to talk to someone who understands security work." Moretti straightened slightly, his professional instincts engaging in response to Tommy's obvious distress. "What's going on?" Tommy accepted the coffee that Marcus provided without being asked, his hands shaking slightly as he raised the mug to his lips. "Something happened at the federal building today. Something that has everyone scared, but nobody's talking about what it actually was." "What kind of something?" Moretti pressed, his detective training taking over despite the informal setting. "This morning, we had what was supposed to be a routine security briefing about new credential verification procedures," Tommy began, his voice dropping to a whisper even though the diner was nearly empty. But halfway through the presentation, federal agents started showing up. Not the usual bureaucrats, but serious people with serious badges who looked like they meant business. Marcus continued cleaning glasses while listening intently, his trained memory cataloging every detail of Tommy's account for later analysis. They started asking questions about our security logs, who had accessed the building over the past week, whether we'd noticed anything unusual about any of the visitors. Tommy continued. Then they showed us a photograph and asked if any of us had seen this person. "What did the photograph show?" Moretti asked. Tommy glanced around the diner nervously before responding. "A man, maybe mid-30s, dark hair, average height and build. The kind of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd unless you were specifically looking for him." But the agents were very interested in whether he'd tried to access the building using false credentials. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as Tommy's description continued. The physical characteristics could have matched thousands of men in the Seattle area, but something about the specific details triggered a recognition that he couldn't immediately identify. "Did they say what he was suspected of doing?" Moretti continued his questioning. "That's where things got weird," Tommy replied. "They wouldn't give us specifics, just said he was a person of interest in a national security investigation. But the way they were acting, it seemed like they were looking for someone who was already inside the system. Someone who might have been operating under false identity for an extended period." The pieces of information that Marcus had been collecting over the past 24 hours suddenly shifted into a pattern that made his blood run cold. Federal security concerns, credential verification procedures, searches for someone operating under false identity, and physical descriptions that could potentially match his own appearance. The possibility that he was the target of the federal investigation hadn't occurred to him until this moment, but now it seemed disturbingly plausible. 3 years of maintaining his civilian cover had required constant vigilance to ensure that no elements of his previous identity remained visible to casual observation. He'd avoided surveillance, maintained operational security around his communications, and carefully managed his financial transactions to prevent the kind of digital tracking that modern investigations relied upon. But no security measures were perfect, and it was possible that some aspect of his activities had triggered attention from agencies that were specifically trained to identify people trying to remain invisible. "They say anything about whether this person was considered dangerous?" Moretti asked, his professional concern evident in his voice. Tommy shook his head. That's what was so strange about the whole thing. They seemed more concerned about what this person might know than what he might do. Like they were worried about information rather than violence. Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle click into place with disturbing clarity. If federal agencies were indeed searching for him, their primary concern would likely be the classified information he still possessed rather than any immediate threat he might pose to public safety. His former career had provided him with knowledge about intelligence operations, communication networks, and security protocols that would be extremely valuable to foreign governments or criminal organizations. The possibility that his cover had been compromised created an immediate tactical problem that required careful consideration. If federal agents were indeed searching for him, continuing his routine activities at the diner would eventually lead to identification and arrest. But altering his patterns too dramatically might also trigger attention from surveillance systems that could be monitoring for exactly that kind of behavioral change. "You all right, Marcus?" Moretti asked, apparently noticing that the diner worker had become unusually quiet during Tommy's account. "Just tired," Marcus replied, forcing his voice to maintain its usual casual tone while his mind raced through possible response scenarios. "Long week." Tommy finished his coffee and stood to leave, his nervous energy still evident in his movements. "I should get back to the building. They've got us doing extra security checks on everyone who enters, and I don't want to be late for my shift." After Tommy left, Moretti remained at the counter, studying Marcus with the focused attention that experienced investigators developed when their instincts suggested that something wasn't quite right. "You sure you're okay?" the detective asked again. "You seem to react pretty strongly to Tommy's story." Marcus recognized that Moretti's concern was genuine, but he also understood that the detective's professional training would have taught him to notice behavioral changes that might indicate deception or hidden knowledge. The situation required careful management to avoid creating additional suspicion while gathering the information he needed to assess his actual level of risk. "Just wondering if I should be worried about increased security affecting the diner," Marcus said, which was technically true even if it didn't address his primary concerns. "We get a lot of government workers as customers. If there's some kind of security crisis going on, it might affect our business." Moretti nodded, accepting the explanation while continuing to study Marcus's demeanor for signs of deeper concern. "I wouldn't worry too much about it affecting civilian businesses. Whatever they're looking for, it seems pretty focused on government facilities and personnel." The reassurance was meant to be comforting, but it actually increased Marcus's concern about his own situation. If federal agencies were focusing their search on government facilities and personnel, it suggested they believed their target had some connection to the intelligence community or federal employment. That kind of specific focus would make it much easier for them to identify someone with Marcus's background once they began conducting detailed investigations of people who might have had access to sensitive information. Marcus spent the remainder of his shift processing the implications of what he'd learned, while maintaining the appearance of normal routine. The few customers who arrived during the late-night hours received their usual efficient service, but his attention was divided between immediate tasks and longer-term strategic planning. By dawn, he'd reached several uncomfortable conclusions about his situation. First, there was a significant possibility that federal agencies were indeed searching for him, based on the combination of timing, focus, and physical description that Tommy had provided. Second, his current cover identity was probably compromised or would be soon, meaning that continuing his routine activities would lead to identification and arrest. Third, he needed to determine exactly what the federal investigation involved before making decisions about how to respond. As the day shift supervisor arrived to take over diner operations, Marcus began the walk home with considerably more awareness of his surroundings than usual. He varied his route slightly, used reflective surfaces to check for surveillance, and maintained the kind of subtle counter-surveillance techniques that had become automatic during his intelligence career. What he observed confirmed his growing suspicion that his situation had become serious. Vehicles that appeared in multiple locations along his route, pedestrians whose movements seemed coordinated rather than random, and the subtle signs of professional surveillance that indicated federal law enforcement was already tracking his activities. Marcus reached his apartment building without incident, but he understood that the circle was closing rapidly. Whatever had triggered the federal investigation They'd apparently identified him as their primary target, and were now conducting the kind of systematic surveillance that would soon provide them with enough evidence to justify arrest and detention. The question now was whether he should wait for them to make their move, or take proactive steps to address the situation before it escalated beyond his ability to control. Marcus climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment with measured steps, his mind calculating probabilities and response scenarios with the mechanical precision that years of intelligence training had burned into his neural pathways. The hallway was empty, but he noticed that the small piece of clear tape he'd placed across his doorframe at ankle height had been disturbed. Someone had entered his apartment during his absence. The discovery confirmed what the street surveillance had already suggested. Federal agents weren't simply searching for him anymore. They'd identified his location and were actively investigating his current identity. The question now was whether they were planning immediate arrest or conducting preliminary intelligence, gathering to better understand his activities and potential associates. Marcus inserted his key with normal movements, opened the door at a casual pace, and entered his apartment as if he hadn't noticed any signs of intrusion, but his trained senses immediately cataloged the subtle evidence of professional search techniques. Furniture slightly displaced from its original positions, personal items arranged with the kind of careful precision that indicated they'd been photographed and documented before being returned to their approximate locations. The search had been thorough but respectful, conducted by people who understood the legal requirements for evidence preservation and the tactical advantages of maintaining the illusion that their target remained unaware of official attention. This suggested FBI or similar federal law enforcement rather than intelligence agencies, which would have been less concerned about legal niceties and more focused on immediate operational requirements. Marcus prepared coffee using his normal morning routine while his peripheral vision inventoried the apartment for anything that might have been left behind. No obvious surveillance devices, no tracking equipment, no signs that the searchers had discovered his hidden compartment or the emergency equipment it contained. But the thoroughness of their work suggested they'd found enough information to confirm his true identity and possibly his previous government employment. His laptop, which he'd left in sleep mode on the kitchen table, showed signs of having been accessed. The screen angle was slightly different, and the external mouse had been moved approximately 2 inches from its original position. Professional computer forensics teams could extract enormous amounts of information from electronic devices, even those protected by military-grade encryption, given sufficient time and resources. The implications were becoming clearer by the hour. Federal law enforcement had identified Marcus Chin, the diner worker, as someone with connections to classified government activities. They'd conducted surveillance to establish his current lifestyle and associates. They'd searched his residence to gather evidence about his activities and capabilities. The next logical step would be arrest and interrogation, probably coordinated to minimize the risk of flight or destruction of evidence. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee and staring out the window at the Seattle skyline while his mind worked through response options. He could attempt to flee, using skills and resources that would probably allow him to disappear, again in a different city under a different identity. He could remain in place and wait for arrest, then rely on legal representation to navigate whatever charges they planned to file. Or he could take the initiative and attempt to control the situation by making contact with the investigating agencies on his own terms. Each option carried significant risks. Flight would confirm their suspicions and transform him from a person of interest into a fugitive actively evading federal law enforcement. Passive waiting would put him at the mercy of investigators whose agenda and legal authority he couldn't predict. But proactive contact might provide opportunities to gather information about the scope of their investigation while demonstrating cooperation that could influence their treatment of his case. His phone rang, the sound startling in the quiet apartment. The caller ID showed Elena's number from the diner, but something about the timing felt wrong. Elena rarely called during her off hours, and never this early in the morning unless there was some kind of emergency affecting diner operations. "Marcus," Elena's voice carried an unusual tension when he answered. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The tone suggested that Elena had been contacted by federal investigators, probably within the last few hours. The timing aligned with what Marcus would have expected if agents were working systematically through his known associates to gather information about his background and current activities. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, maintaining the slightly confused tone that an innocent person would naturally display when confronted with unexpected official attention. "Federal agents came to the diner this morning asking questions about you," Elena said directly. "They wanted to know about your employment history, your personal habits, whether you'd ever mentioned having military or government experience. They were very polite, but they were also very thorough in their questions." Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. The investigation had moved beyond surveillance and search to active information gathering from his associates. This suggested they were building a comprehensive case file rather than preparing for immediate arrest, which might provide him with additional time to assess the situation and formulate an appropriate response. "What kind of questions?" he asked, knowing that Elena's answers would help him understand how much the investigators already knew and what specific concerns were driving their inquiry. "They asked about your work schedule, whether you ever used the diner's computer for personal business, if you'd ever mentioned having specialized skills or training that seemed unusual for someone in your position," Elena replied. "They also asked whether you'd ever seemed nervous or concerned about anything, like you were worried about being discovered or identified." The question suggested that federal investigators suspected Marcus of operating under false identity, but weren't certain about the specific nature of his deception or his reasons for maintaining anonymity. They were gathering information to determine whether he represented a security threat, a criminal fugitive, or something else that required federal attention. "Did they say what this was about?" Marcus asked. "They were vague about the details, but they mentioned something about national security and the need to verify the backgrounds of people who might have access to sensitive information or facilities," Elena explained. "They seemed particularly interested in whether you'd ever asked questions about government employees who eat at the diner, or if you'd shown unusual interest in federal buildings or security procedures." This information confirmed Marcus's growing understanding of the investigation's focus. Federal agents weren't simply trying to identify him. They were trying to determine whether he'd been conducting intelligence-gathering activities while maintaining his civilian cover. The questions about government employees and security procedures suggested they suspected he might be working for foreign intelligence services or criminal organizations that were interested in federal operations. "Elena, I need you to know that I've never done anything to harm the diner or put you or our customers at risk," Marcus said, which was completely true even if it didn't address the larger questions about his background and current activities. "I believe you," Elena replied, but her voice carried the uncertainty of someone whose world had suddenly become more complicated than she'd expected. "But Marcus, these weren't local police asking routine questions. These were federal agents with serious badges who seemed genuinely concerned about something. If there's anything you need to tell me about your situation, now would be a good time." Marcus appreciated Elena's directness, but he also understood that providing her with additional information would only complicate her position if federal agents returned with more questions. The best protection he could offer was to maintain the pretense that he was simply an ordinary civilian who'd somehow attracted unwarranted official attention. "I honestly don't know why they're interested in me," he said. "I've been working at the diner for 3 years, paying my taxes, staying out of trouble. Maybe there's some kind of mistake, or maybe I resemble someone they're looking for." "Maybe," Elena agreed, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Just be careful, okay? Whatever this is about, it seems serious enough that they're putting significant resources into investigating you." After ending the call, Marcus sat quietly for several minutes, processing the implications of what Elena had shared. The federal investigation was broader and more systematic than he'd initially realized. They weren't simply trying to locate him. They were building a comprehensive assessment of his activities, associations, and potential threats. This suggested a level of official concern that went beyond routine background checks or criminal investigations. The scope of their inquiry also indicated that someone with significant authority had authorized the allocation of substantial resources to understanding his current situation. Federal agents conducting systematic interviews with associates, performing detailed searches of residences, and implementing surveillance operations represented expensive investments that required justification at multiple levels of government bureaucracy. Marcus walked to his bathroom mirror and studied his reflection with the analytical detachment that intelligence training had taught him to apply to tactical situations. The face looking back at him belonged to someone whose carefully constructed civilian identity was rapidly becoming untenable. Within hours or days, federal agents would have enough information to justify arrest and detention while they conducted more detailed investigations into his background and activities. The time for passive observation and strategic planning was ending. The situation required immediate action to prevent his complete loss of control over the circumstances that would determine his immediate future. But the specific nature of that action needed to be carefully calibrated to achieve the best possible outcome given the constraints and risks he was facing. Marcus returned to his kitchen table and opened his laptop, accessing encrypted communication channels that he'd maintained despite 3 years of civilian life. The networks were still active, though the traffic pattern suggested that many of his former colleagues had either left government service or been reassigned to different operational roles. But certain contact protocols remained functional, providing him with potential access to people who might have information about the current investigation or the authority to influence its direction. He composed a brief message using codes that would identify him to recipients while providing minimal information that could compromise operational security if the communication was intercepted. The message requested a secure meeting with someone who had authority to discuss federal investigations involving former intelligence personnel. He included enough details to confirm his identity while avoiding specific references that might create additional legal complications if the message was reviewed by unauthorized personnel. After sending the message through multiple routing protocols designed to obscure its origin and destination, Marcus began preparing for the possibility that federal agents might arrive at his apartment before he received a response. He gathered the contents of his hidden compartment, including identity documents, emergency funds, and communication equipment that would allow him to maintain contact with certain networks if he needed to relocate quickly. The equipment represented capabilities that federal law enforcement would certainly view as evidence of ongoing intelligence activities or criminal intent, but it also provided him with options that might prove crucial if the situation deteriorated beyond his ability to resolve through cooperation and negotiation. Marcus dressed in clothes that would allow him to blend into Seattle's downtown business district, choosing garments that were professional enough to command respect in official settings but unremarkable enough to avoid attracting attention in public spaces. He pocketed the emergency funds and identification documents, leaving the more sensitive equipment in its concealed location, where it would be available if needed but wouldn't automatically incriminate him if he was arrested during the day. By mid-morning, he was walking through Seattle's financial district, using public transportation and crowded pedestrian areas to complicate any surveillance efforts while making his way toward the federal building where Tommy worked. The irony of voluntarily approaching the location where federal agents were coordinating their investigation wasn't lost on him, but it also represented the kind of unexpected tactical choice that might provide advantages over more predictable responses. Marcus positioned himself at a coffee shop across the street from the federal building, selecting a table near the window that provided clear observation of the entrances, while keeping invisible to anyone who might be watching for him. The location allowed him to monitor federal agent activity, while presenting himself as someone who wasn't attempting to avoid official attention. His encrypted phone buzzed with a response to his morning message. The reply was brief but contained enough coded information to confirm that his contact request had reached appropriate recipients. He was instructed to proceed to a specific location in downtown Seattle, where someone with relevant authority would meet him within 2 hours. The meeting location was a public park that provided natural security advantages for both parties while minimizing the risk of surveillance or unwanted interference. Marcus finished his coffee, left the shop through a side exit that wasn't visible from the federal building, and began making his way through the city center using counter-surveillance techniques that would reveal whether he was being actively followed. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions about the scope of federal attention focused on his activities. At least 3 different surveillance teams were maintaining loose observation of his movements, coordinating through communication methods that suggested professional law enforcement rather than intelligence agency operations. The surveillance was competent but not aggressive, suggesting that federal agents were more interested in monitoring his activities than preventing his movement through the city. Marcus arrived at the designated meeting location 15 minutes early, using the extra time to conduct final security checks and position himself where he could observe approaching personnel, while maintaining escape routes if the situation proved to be a trap rather than a genuine negotiation opportunity. The park was moderately busy with lunch-hour pedestrians and casual visitors, providing sufficient background activity to obscure conversations while making it difficult for surveillance teams to maintain close observation without becoming obvious. At precisely the scheduled time, a woman in her early 40s approached his bench, carrying a newspaper and moving with the confident posture of someone accustomed to exercising authority in challenging situations. She wore a professional business suit that could have belonged to any government employee or corporate executive, but her situational awareness and measured movements suggested law enforcement or intelligence background. "Mr. Chun," she said, settling onto the bench beside him without waiting for invitation or confirmation of his identity. "My name is Director Sarah Collins, FBI Counterintelligence Division. I believe you requested this meeting to discuss your current situation with federal investigators." The identification confirmed several of Marcus's suspicions about the investigation, while providing crucial information about the scope and authority of the people involved. FBI Counterintelligence Division suggested that federal agents viewed his case as involving potential espionage or national security threats rather than routine criminal activity. Director-level involvement indicated that someone with significant authority had taken personal interest in resolving his situation. "Director Collins," Marcus replied, maintaining the respectful tone appropriate for addressing senior federal officials while avoiding any statements that might be interpreted as admissions of guilt or wrongdoing. "I appreciate your willingness to meet under these circumstances." "Let's dispense with formalities," Collins said, opening her newspaper to create the appearance of casual conversation while providing visual concealment for their discussion. "We know who you are, Daniel Morrison. We know about your previous employment with the Defense Intelligence Agency, your specialization in deep cover operations, and your unofficial termination 3 years ago following the Cascade operation." The use of his real name and specific operational details sent a chill through Marcus's nervous system that he worked to conceal through controlled breathing and disciplined body language. Federal investigators had clearly gained access to classified personnel files and operational records that were supposed to be sealed indefinitely. The mention of the Cascade operation was particularly concerning, as it involved activities that had never been officially acknowledged and weren't supposed to exist in any accessible database. "Director, I'm not sure what you're referring to," Marcus replied carefully. "My name is Marcus Chun, and I work at the Night Owl Diner here in Seattle." Collins turned a page of her newspaper with deliberate precision, her movement creating an opportunity for her to study his face while maintaining the pretense of reading. "Mr. Morrison, we have fingerprint matches, facial recognition confirmations, and digital forensics evidence that conclusively establishes your identity. Continuing to maintain your cover story will only complicate an already difficult situation." The revelation that federal investigators possessed multiple forms of biometric confirmation eliminated any possibility of maintaining his false identity through denial or misdirection. Collins was offering him an opportunity to cooperate voluntarily, rather than forcing her to proceed through arrest and formal interrogation. But she was also making clear that his options for resistance or evasion had been effectively eliminated. "Assuming for the sake of argument that you're correct about my identity," Marcus said, choosing his words carefully to avoid direct admission while opening the door for productive negotiation, "what exactly would you want to discuss?" "We want to understand what you've been doing for the past 3 years, who you've been in contact with, and whether your activities pose any ongoing threat to national security," Collins replied. "We also want to know why someone with your background and capabilities chose to disappear rather than seeking official assistance with whatever problems led to your departure from government service." The question suggested that federal investigators were genuinely uncertain about his motivations and activities rather than operating from complete knowledge of his situation. This uncertainty represented potential leverage that Marcus might be able to use to influence the direction and outcome of their investigation. "If I were the person you believe me to be," Marcus said, maintaining the conditional structure that avoided direct confession while allowing substantive discussion, "what would be the legal implications of cooperating with your investigation?" Collins folded her newspaper and placed it on the bench between them, the gesture creating symbolic separation between the preliminary discussion and whatever formal arrangements might follow. "That would depend entirely on what we learned during the cooperation process. If our investigation confirmed that you've been living quietly under an assumed identity without engaging in activities that threaten national security, the legal complications would be minimal. If we discovered evidence of ongoing intelligence operations, espionage activities, or criminal behavior, the situation would become much more serious." The offer represented a reasonable framework for negotiation, but Marcus understood that federal prosecutors rarely honored informal agreements when they discovered information that exceeded their initial expectations. Cooperation that began as damage control could quickly escalate into comprehensive exposure of activities and associations that went far beyond what investigators initially suspected. "What kind of cooperation would you expect?" Marcus asked. "Complete disclosure of your activities since leaving government service, access to your communication records and financial transactions, and assistance in understanding any ongoing security implications of your previous operations," Collins explained. "We would also expect cooperation in identifying and addressing any security vulnerabilities that your situation might have created for current government operations." The scope of cooperation she described would effectively eliminate any privacy or autonomy that Marcus had maintained during his 3 years of civilian life. But it would also provide him with some control over the pace and direction of disclosure while potentially minimizing the legal consequences of his unofficial departure from government service. "If I were to consider such cooperation," Marcus sighed, "what assurances could you provide regarding the protection of information that might compromise ongoing operations or the safety of other personnel?" Collins smiled for the first time during their conversation, the expression suggesting genuine appreciation for his concern about operational security, rather than purely personal considerations. "Mr. Morrison, the fact that you're asking that question tells me more about your character and motivations than 3 years of surveillance could have revealed. Yes, we would provide appropriate protections for sensitive information. And yes, we would coordinate with relevant agencies to ensure that cooperation doesn't create additional security risks." The assurance was encouraging, but Marcus understood that federal agencies often interpreted appropriate protections differently than the people whose information they were protecting. Still, Collins' willingness to address his concerns suggested that she viewed him as a potential ally rather than simply a target for prosecution. "I need time to consider your proposal," Marcus said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Collins replied, standing and retrieving her newspaper. "After that, we'll proceed with formal arrest and interrogation. The choice is yours, but I hope you'll recognize that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than confrontation." As Collins walked away, Marcus remained on the bench for several additional minutes, processing the implications of their conversation while observing the surveillance teams that had maintained their positions throughout the meeting. The federal investigation was clearly moving toward resolution one way or another, and his options for influencing the outcome were rapidly narrowing. The walk back to his apartment provided additional time for strategic consideration, but the fundamental choice was relatively straightforward. He could cooperate with Director Collins and accept whatever legal and personal consequences followed from full disclosure of his activities, or he could attempt to flee and spend the remainder of his life as a fugitive from federal law enforcement. Neither option was particularly appealing, but one offered the possibility of eventually resuming some version of normal life, while the other guaranteed permanent separation from society and constant fear of discovery. The decision, when viewed objectively, wasn't really much of a choice at all. Marcus spent the afternoon preparing for voluntary surrender by organizing his personal affairs and destroying any remaining materials that might complicate the federal investigation without providing useful information. He drafted a brief letter explaining his situation to Elena, thanking her for 3 years of employment and apologizing for any complications that his circumstances might create for diner operations. As evening approached, he called Director Collins using the contact information she'd provided during their meeting. "Director Collins," he said when she answered, "this is Daniel Morrison. I'm prepared to accept your proposal for cooperation." "I'm glad to hear that," Collins replied, her tone suggesting genuine relief rather than simple professional satisfaction. "Can you meet us at the federal building tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock? We'll begin with preliminary interviews and work toward more comprehensive debriefing sessions over the following days." "I'll be there," Marcus confirmed. After ending the call, he spent his final evening of anonymity walking through Seattle's downtown district, observing the city that had provided him with 3 years of peaceful invisibility. Tomorrow he would begin the process of reclaiming his true identity and accepting whatever consequences followed from his unauthorized departure from government service. The night shift at the diner proceeded without him for the first time in 3 years. Elena would probably spend the evening wondering why her reliable employee had suddenly disappeared without explanation. Detective Moretti would arrive for his usual late-night coffee and find someone else behind the counter. Tommy Kowalski would continue his security duties at the federal building, unaware that the person he'd been unwittingly helping to locate had decided to surrender voluntarily. Marcus packed a small bag with essential personal items, knowing that his immediate future would likely involve federal detention facilities and interview rooms rather than his comfortable apartment. The hidden compartment behind his closet remained sealed, its contents waiting for investigators, who would probably discover it within hours of gaining access to his residence. As he prepared for bed, Marcus realized that his 3 years of civilian Life had served their purpose more completely than he'd originally intended. The experience of working an ordinary job, developing relationships with regular people, and maintaining a routine existence had provided him with perspective about his previous career that wouldn't have been possible while he remained embedded in the intelligence community. He'd learned that his skills and knowledge were valuable not because they made him special or superior to other people, but because they could be used to serve purposes larger than personal advancement or institutional loyalty. The challenge now would be finding ways to apply those capabilities in service of legitimate government objectives while maintaining the ethical foundation that his civilian experience had helped him develop. The next morning arrived with the gray overcast that typified Pacific Northwest weather, but Marcus felt a sense of clarity that had been absent during his months of uncertainty about federal attention and investigation. He dressed in his best civilian clothes, gathered his identification documents, and prepared to walk into the federal building not as Marcus Chen, the diner worker, but as Daniel Morrison, former intelligence operative, seeking to resolve the complications that had led to 3 years of unofficial exile. The surveillance teams were still in position when he left his apartment, but their posture had shifted from observation to escort. Federal agents were ensuring his safe arrival at the designated meeting location rather than simply monitoring his activities for investigative purposes. The change represented a significant evolution in their relationship and suggested that Director Collins had accepted his decision to cooperate as genuine rather than tactical misdirection. Marcus walked through Seattle's morning rush hour with the measured pace of someone who was no longer hiding from official attention. The federal building loomed ahead, its imposing architecture representing both the authority he'd once served and the system of justice that would now determine his immediate future. At exactly 9 o'clock, he approached the security checkpoint, where Tommy Kowalski was beginning his morning shift. The guard's reaction to seeing his regular customer in this context would have been amusing under different circumstances, but Marcus was focused on managing the transition from unofficial cooperation to formal surrender. "Sir," Tommy said, his voice carrying confusion and concern as he recognized Marcus approaching the federal entrance. "I need to see identification and state your business in the building." Marcus handed over his authentic identification documents, the ones bearing his real name rather than the carefully constructed false identity he'd maintained for 3 years. "Daniel Morrison, here for a meeting with Director Sarah Collins, FBI Counterintelligence Division." Tommy's expression shifted through several emotional stages as he processed the information. Recognition, surprise, understanding, and finally, a kind of professional respect for someone whose true background had been far more complex than anyone had realized. "Yes, sir, Mr. Morrison," Tommy said, his tone now carrying the formal courtesy reserved for people whose credentials commanded serious attention. "Director Collins is expecting you. Please proceed to the 16th floor." As Marcus passed through the metal detectors and security screening that Tommy operated every day, he understood that the guard was probably beginning to realize how much he'd underestimated the quiet customer who'd shared casual conversations about federal security procedures. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, but both men maintained professional dignity as the situation unfolded according to its own inevitable logic. The elevator ride to the 16th floor provided Marcus with a few final moments to prepare mentally for the interviews and negotiations that would determine whether his decision to cooperate would lead to resolution or simply create additional complications. Director Collins had offered reasonable terms for voluntary surrender, but federal investigations had a way of expanding beyond their original scope once they began uncovering information that exceeded initial expectations. When the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped into a world that felt both familiar and foreign after 3 years of civilian life. Federal agents moved through hallways with the purposeful efficiency that he remembered from his previous career, but now he was viewing their activities as a subject of investigation, rather than a colleague participating in shared objectives. Director Collins was waiting for him in a conference room that had been prepared for extended interviews. The space contained recording equipment, legal documentation, and the institutional atmosphere that characterized formal government proceedings. But Collins' demeanor remained professional and respectful rather than adversarial, suggesting that she continued to view him as a potential asset rather than simply a security threat requiring neutralization. "Mr. Morrison," she said, standing to greet him as he entered the room, "thank you for honoring our agreement. I hope we can resolve this situation in a way that serves everyone's legitimate interests." Marcus took the indicated seat across from her at the conference table, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether his 3 years of exile would end in redemption or simply transform into a different kind of imprisonment. "Director Collins," he replied, "I'm prepared to provide complete cooperation with your investigation. Where would you like to begin?" Director Collins activated the recording equipment with practiced efficiency, her movements conveying the weight of formal proceedings while maintaining the respectful atmosphere she'd established during their park meeting. The conference room's sterile environment felt worlds apart from the comfortable anonymity of the Night Owl Diner. But Daniel found himself surprisingly calm as he prepared to reclaim an identity he'd buried for 3 years. "For the record," Collins began, "this is Director Sarah Collins, FBI Counterintelligence Division, conducting a voluntary interview with Daniel Morrison, former Defense Intelligence Agency operative, on October 15th at 9:15 a.m. Mr. Morrison, you've waived your right to legal representation and agreed to provide full cooperation regarding your activities since departing government service. Is this correct?" "It is," Daniel confirmed, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. Collins consulted a thick file that Daniel recognized as containing far more information than should have been accessible through normal channels. "Let's begin with the Cascade operation. Our records indicate that you were the primary deep cover operative for a mission that officially never existed, involving the infiltration of a terrorist financing network operating out of Eastern Europe. The operation concluded with significant intelligence gains, but also resulted in your immediate extraction and subsequent departure from active service. Can you explain what happened?" The question struck at the heart of why Daniel had chosen exile over continued government employment. The Cascade operation had been a textbook example of intelligence work that achieved its strategic objectives while creating political complications that made continued official acknowledgement impossible. "The Cascade operation was successful from an intelligence perspective," Daniel said carefully. "We identified and documented a network of financial institutions that were facilitating terrorist operations across multiple countries. The information we gathered led to the disruption of planned attacks and the arrest of several high-value targets." "But something went wrong," Collins prompted, her tone indicating she already knew the answer but needed his perspective on record. Daniel paused, remembering the moment strategic success had transformed into personal catastrophe. "During the final phase of the operation, we discovered that one of the network's primary funding sources was connected to intelligence assets from a friendly government. Exposing the network would have compromised ongoing operations and created diplomatic incidents with an allied nation. So you were ordered to bury the intelligence you'd gathered," Collins said, her statement revealing the political calculations that had ended Daniel's career. "I was ordered to classify the entire operation beyond normal access levels and to accept reassignment to a position that would effectively end my operational career," Daniel replied. "When I objected to the decision, pointing out that suppressing the intelligence would allow continued terrorist financing, I was told that political considerations outweighed operational concerns." Collins made notes in the margin of her file, her expression suggesting she was comparing Daniel's account with information from other sources. "According to our records, you refused a reassignment and submitted a resignation that was never formally processed. Instead, you simply disappeared from your assigned duty station. I realized that my continued presence in the intelligence community would be a liability for everyone involved, Daniel explained. The people who wanted to suppress the Cascade intelligence viewed me as a potential whistleblower. The people who supported disclosure viewed me as someone who'd been silenced by political pressure. The safest option for all parties was for me to disappear completely. So you created the Marcus Chun identity and spent 3 years working at a Seattle diner, Collins said, her tone neutral but her eyes showing something that might have been respect for his decision. I chose work that would keep me occupied without requiring skills that might attract attention, Daniel confirmed. The diner provided routine, anonymity, and the opportunity to observe civilian life from a perspective I'd never experienced during my government career. Collins leaned back in her chair, studying Daniel's face with the focused attention of someone trying to assess his motivations and reliability. During those 3 years, did you maintain any contact with Foreign Intelligence Services criminal organizations or other entities that might be interested in the information you possessed? No, Daniel replied without hesitation. I deliberately severed all connections to my previous career and avoided any activities that might compromise ongoing operations or create security risks for former colleagues. What about the encrypted communication equipment we found in your apartment? Collins asked, referring to items that Daniel had expected them to discover during their search. Emergency equipment maintained for personal security, Daniel explained. After spending years in deep cover operations, completely cutting myself off from secure communication channels felt like an unnecessary vulnerability. But I never used the equipment to contact anyone connected to my previous work. Collins made additional notes before continuing her questioning. Mr. Morrison, 3 days ago, our cybersecurity analysts detected unusual activity in communication networks associated with your former unit. Someone was using protocols and access codes that matched your operational signature. Can you explain how that might have happened? The question revealed why federal investigators had suddenly intensified their search for him. Someone was apparently conducting intelligence operations using credentials and techniques associated with Daniel's previous work, creating the impression that he might be actively engaged in unauthorized activities. Director, I haven't accessed any classified networks or used any operational protocols since leaving government service, Daniel said, understanding immediately that his situation had become more complicated than simple unauthorized absence from duty. If someone is using methods associated with my previous work, they're either using stolen credentials or they have access to operational details that should be restricted to a very small number of people. That's what we suspected, Collins replied, her acknowledgement confirming that federal investigators had considered the possibility that Daniel was being impersonated rather than operating independently. The question is whether you have any information that might help us identify who has access to your operational methods and why they might be using them now. Daniel considered the implications of the question carefully. If someone was using his operational signature to conduct unauthorized intelligence activities, it suggested that classified information from the Cascade operation had been compromised, or that someone with access to his personnel files was attempting to implicate him in current security breaches. The Cascade operation involved coordination with assets from multiple agencies, Daniel said slowly. If someone wanted to use my operational signature for unauthorized activities, they would need access to classified files that document my specific methods and protocols. That level of access would be restricted to senior officials in intelligence agencies or people with administrative authority over operational records. Collins exchanged glances with another agent who had been observing the interview from a corner of the room. The silent communication suggested that Daniel's assessment aligned with their own suspicions about the source of the security breach. Mr. Morrison, Would you be willing to assist our investigation into these unauthorized activities? Collins asked. Your expertise in the operational methods being used could be crucial for identifying the actual perpetrator and preventing future security breaches. The offer represented exactly the kind of opportunity Daniel had hoped might emerge from his decision to cooperate. Instead of facing prosecution for unauthorized departure from government service, he was being invited to contribute his expertise to resolving an ongoing security crisis. What would that assistance involve? Daniel asked. Technical consultation on the investigation, analysis of the unauthorized activities to identify patterns that might reveal the perpetrator's identity, and possibly direct participation in operations designed to identify and apprehend whoever is responsible, Collins explained. The scope of involvement she described would effectively restore Daniel to active service in the intelligence community, though presumably under very different circumstances than his previous career. The irony wasn't lost on him that his exile from government service was ending with an invitation to return in order to address security problems that might be connected to the political decisions that had driven him away in the first place. I'm willing to provide whatever assistance you believe would be useful, Daniel replied. Collins smiled, the expression transforming her professional demeanor into something warmer and more personal. Mr. Morrison, I should tell you that this investigation has revealed some disturbing information about the circumstances surrounding your departure from government service. The officials who ordered the suppression of your Cascade intelligence have since been identified as having inappropriate relationships with foreign governments. Your refusal to accept their decisions may have prevented a significant intelligence compromise. The revelation recontextualized everything Daniel had experienced during the past 3 years. His conviction that political considerations had overridden legitimate intelligence concerns appeared to have been vindicated by subsequent investigations. The exile he'd chosen to protect himself and his former colleagues had inadvertently protected him from association with officials who were later identified as security risks. Are you saying that the people who wanted to bury the Cascade operation were themselves compromised? Daniel asked. We're saying that your instincts about their motivations appear to have been correct, Collins replied carefully. The investigation into current security breaches has revealed evidence that some of the officials involved in suppressing your operation were providing information to foreign intelligence services. The confirmation that his departure from government service had been justified by circumstances he couldn't have known at the time provided Daniel with a sense of vindication that he hadn't expected to experience. But it also suggested that his return to intelligence work might involve confronting people and situations connected to the original Cascade operation. When would you need me to begin this consultation? Daniel asked. Immediately, Collins replied. The unauthorized activities are escalating, and we believe they're connected to a planned operation that could compromise multiple ongoing intelligence efforts. Your expertise could be crucial for preventing a significant security disaster. Daniel understood that the timeline Collins described meant his transition from civilian life to active intelligence work would be abrupt and comprehensive. There would be no gradual reintroduction to government service, no opportunity to slowly readjust to the demands and responsibilities of classified operations. I'll need to make arrangements for my civilian obligations, Daniel said, thinking about Elena and the diner staff who would need to adjust to his sudden absence. We've already contacted your employer and explained that you're assisting with a federal investigation, Collins replied. Your position will be held in case you decide to return to civilian life after this matter is resolved. The efficiency with which federal agents had managed the practical details of his transition suggested they'd been planning for his cooperation even before their park meeting. Collins had apparently been confident that he would choose voluntary assistance over flight or legal resistance. What's the first step? Daniel asked. Collins stood and gathered her files, her movements indicating that the formal interview portion of their interaction was ending. Technical briefing on the unauthorized activities, followed by analysis sessions where you'll review the evidence and provide your assessment of the perpetrator's methods and objectives. If your analysis confirms our suspicions, we'll move to operational planning for direct intervention. Daniel followed Collins out of the conference room and through corridors that buzzed with the controlled urgency of a federal investigation in progress. The atmosphere reminded him of the command centers he'd worked in during his operational career, but now he was returning as someone whose perspective had been shaped by 3 years of civilian experience. The briefing room they entered contained multiple screens displaying network diagrams, communication intercepts, and analysis charts that documented the unauthorized activities Collins had described. Several analysts looked up as they entered, their expressions showing curiosity about the consultant who'd been brought in to assist with their investigation. "Team, this is Daniel Morrison, the operative whose signature is being used in the unauthorized activities," Collins announced. "He'll be providing technical consultation on the perpetrator's methods and helping us develop response strategies." Daniel studied the displays with growing concern as he began to understand the scope of what someone was accomplishing using his operational identity. The unauthorized activities weren't simply isolated security breaches. They represented a systematic intelligence operation that was targeting multiple classified programs and compromising information that could affect national security. "How long has this been going on?" Daniel asked. "We've identified definitive evidence going back 6 weeks, but there are indicators that suggest the activities might have been developing for several months," replied Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead analyst for the investigation. Daniel examined the communication patterns and access logs that documented the unauthorized activities, his trained mind immediately recognizing elements that confirmed these were indeed sophisticated intelligence operations rather than random criminal activities or isolated security breaches. "Whoever is doing this has detailed knowledge of my operational methods," Daniel observed. "But they're also making modifications that suggest they understand the limitations of those methods and are trying to improve them." "What kind of modifications?" Collins asked. Daniel pointed to specific entries in the access logs, highlighting patterns that revealed the perpetrator's strategic thinking. "They're using communication protocols that are more secure than what one originally developed, but they're also accessing information sources that I never had clearance to approach. This suggests someone with higher authority levels than I possessed, but who needed my methods to avoid detection while conducting unauthorized operations." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, her attention focused on Daniel's analysis. "Are you saying this is someone with legitimate high-level access who's using your identity to cover unauthorized activities?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Daniel confirmed. "Someone in a senior position is conducting operations that exceed their authority, and they're using my operational signature to create plausible deniability if their activities are discovered." The room fell silent as the implications of Daniel's assessment became clear to everyone present. If his analysis was correct, the unauthorized activities represented not just security breaches, but potential treason by someone with significant authority in the intelligence community. "Do you have any suspects in mind?" Collins asked. Daniel studied the evidence displays for several additional minutes, his mind working through the logical possibilities based on who would have had access to his operational files and the authority to access the information sources being targeted. "Based on the access patterns and the specific information being targeted, I believe you're looking for someone who was involved in the original decision to suppress the Cascade operation," Daniel said finally. "Someone who knew that my methods could be used to access classified information without triggering normal security alerts." Collins exchanged significant glances with Dr. Walsh and the other analysts in the room. "Mr. Morrison, that assessment aligns with our own suspicions. We believe the perpetrator is Deputy Director Robert Hawkins, who was one of the senior officials involved in classifying your Cascade intelligence. The identification of Hawkins as the suspected perpetrator provided Daniel with a sense of completion that he hadn't expected. The man who had ended his career by ordering the suppression of legitimate intelligence was now apparently using Daniel's own methods to conduct unauthorized operations that threatened national security. "What evidence do you have against Hawkins?" Daniel asked. "Circumstantial evidence that suggests he has the access and authority necessary to conduct these operations, but nothing that would support criminal prosecution," Dr. Walsh explained. "We need direct evidence of his involvement in the unauthorized activities, which is where you come in," Collins added. "We need someone who understands both Hawkins' motivations and the operational methods being used to develop a strategy for gathering that direct evidence." Daniel understood that his role in the investigation would involve more than technical consultation. Federal investigators were asking him to help design an operation that would expose the man who had destroyed his career, using skills that Hawkins himself had forced Daniel to develop during 3 years of unofficial exile. "What kind of operation are you proposing?" Daniel asked. "A controlled sting operation where we provide Hawkins with opportunities to access client information using your operational methods, while monitoring his activities to gather evidence of unauthorized intelligence gathering," Collins explained. The proposal represented exactly the kind of complex operation that Daniel had specialized in during his previous career. But it also involved personal risks that went beyond normal professional considerations, since Hawkins would certainly recognize Daniel's involvement if the operation was discovered prematurely. "I'm willing to participate," Daniel said, understanding that his decision would determine whether his return to intelligence work would succeed in resolving the security crisis or simply create additional complications for everyone involved. "Excellent," Collins replied. "We'll begin operational planning immediately. Dr. Walsh will brief you on the specific intelligence targets that Hawkins has been accessing, and we'll develop scenarios that will give him opportunities to reveal his unauthorized activities while we gather evidence." As the briefing session continued into the afternoon, Daniel found himself fully re-engaged with the intellectual challenges and strategic thinking that had defined his previous career. But his 3 years of civilian experience had also provided him with perspective about the human costs of intelligence operations and the importance of ensuring that professional objectives served legitimate public interests rather than simply advancing institutional agendas. The sting operation they developed over the following days represented a synthesis of Daniel's operational expertise with the FBI's law enforcement capabilities and legal requirements. Instead of the freewheeling approach that had characterized some of his previous intelligence work, this operation would be carefully documented and conducted according to strict protocols that would ensure any evidence gathered could be used in criminal prosecution. 2 weeks later, Daniel found himself in a monitoring station watching as Deputy Director Hawkins accessed classified networks using operational methods that Daniel had developed years earlier. The evidence was unmistakable. A senior intelligence official was conducting unauthorized operations that compromised national security while using the identity of an operative he had forced into exile. "We have everything we need for prosecution," Collins announced as they watched Hawkins download classified information that exceeded his authorization levels. Daniel felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he watched his former superior's arrest through surveillance cameras positioned throughout the federal building. Justice was being served, but it had required exposing the corruption and incompetence that had infected the intelligence community he had once served with genuine dedication. 6 months later, Daniel found himself in a new position within the FBI's counterintelligence division, applying his operational expertise to protecting national security, while working within legal and ethical frameworks that his civilian experience had taught him to value. The Night Owl Diner had hired a replacement for Marcus Chun, But Alina occasionally sent text messages updating him on the customers who still asked about their reliable night shift worker. Detective Moretti had learned about Daniel's true identity through media coverage of the Hawkins case, and he'd expressed amazement that his late-night coffee conversations had been with someone whose expertise exceeded anything he'd encountered during his law enforcement career. Tommy Kowalski had been promoted to senior security supervisor, partly in recognition of his unwitting assistance in the investigation that had resolved a significant intelligence crisis. Daniel's apartment remained unchanged, but he'd added photographs and personal items that reflected his restored sense of identity and purpose. The hidden compartment behind his closet now contained legitimate FBI credentials and equipment issued for his official duties, rather than emergency supplies maintained against an uncertain future. The story had come full circle in ways that Daniel could never have anticipated when he'd chosen exile 3 years earlier. His decision to disappear had protected him from association with corrupt officials while positioning him to eventually help expose their unauthorized activities. His civilian experience had provided him with perspective that made him more effective in his restored intelligence career while ensuring that he approached his responsibilities with appropriate respect for legal and ethical constraints. Most importantly, Daniel had learned that true expertise involved not just technical capabilities, but the wisdom to understand when fun, and how those capabilities should be applied in service of legitimate objectives. The skills that had once made him valuable as an intelligence operative were now serving to protect the same democratic institutions and legal principles that his civilian experience had taught him to appreciate. As he prepared for another day of protecting national security through legitimate government service, Daniel reflected on the unexpected journey that had transformed him from an exiled operative into someone whose expertise was valued precisely because it had been tempered by experience in the civilian world he was working to protect. The ghost had returned not as a legend seeking recognition, but as a professional whose true identity had been forged through trials that most people would never face and refined through experiences that had taught him the difference between capability and wisdom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.